Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Education Unlocked. I'm so excited to welcome our amazing guest today, Dr. Kimberly MacKinney, on our podcast. Hey, Kimberly, how are you? So excited to have you on here.
I am wonderful. How are you?
I'm good. And, so excited to have you join us on this awesome Tuesday. And our audience is so excited to have you and to learn a little bit more about your background as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you to do an introduction and we'll go from there.
All right, great. Well, I have been in education for 32 years. I started as a teacher's aide at a middle school, working in an intervention classroom out in Long Beach. And then from there, as I was getting my degree and my credential, I then moved into teaching US history, a freshman study skills class. And then also, I was a cheer coach and an ASB advisor. And then from there, I moved into administration. I had the opportunity to open a new school as an activities director as well as an assistant principal. And I went on to work at the district office. All of this, all in Fontana. I was here for 17 years. And then I had the opportunity to go to a new district and look at the alternative ed and the personalized learning aspects of education. And so that was something that really appealed to me because education is definitely not one size fits all. And so I went to Oro Grande, and when I went to Oro Grande, I was there for another 8 years. And during that time, I was promoted to Assistant Superintendent of Educational Services, where I had the pleasure of overseeing their K-12 program, alternative ed, independent study, all things education and student services. And after being there for about 8 years, I realized that my values and my outlook on what education should look like in the future and what I wanted to do in terms of growing leaders wasn't quite matching up with the direction that the district was going. And so I made the brave decision to leave Oro Grande, and I started my own coaching and consulting firm where I was doing coaching to principals and coordinators, district office folks, which was a blast. I really enjoyed coaching and growing leaders because that has always been my primary passion. And so I did that. And then after about a year, a little less than a year, I had the opportunity to come back home to Fontana. Fontana is also where I grew up and went to school and graduated from. So the opportunity to come back home to Fontana was an amazing opportunity. And so I'm here now as the executive director of secondary schools. During that whole time, I had amazing mentors, and I think that also helped grow my passion for coaching and establishing leaders. My father was an educator, my close family friends are educators, and they all had an influence on the work that I did and my philosophy of education. And because I'm so passionate about growing leaders, I'm also really active in AXA. I'm the Women's Leadership Network lead for Region 12, which is the San Bernardino County region of AXA. I also work with CALSA and that Women's Leadership Network team. And then in my spare time, I'm also the chief counselor for the American Legion Auxiliary California Girls State program that we'll talk about a little later.
Amazing. I am so excited to have you on here. And I think my first question really comes kind of in what you mentioned a little bit with growing leaders. What does that look like to you in practice, right? Especially for many of those who may just not see themselves as leaders yet. Like, could you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm very curious on that as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think leadership is something that can be grown and nurtured in everyone, whether you see it in yourself or not. When you see it in yourself and you start to see the different ways that you can lead, I think you are able to really grow and lean into that leadership. With leadership comes a lot of responsibility, and you have to be willing to step into that responsibility. Not everyone is, and that's okay, but with leadership comes responsibility. I think that also when it comes to growing leaders is helping people recognize the skills that they bring and how it can contribute to the greater good, whether that's the greater good of the instructional program at a school or working with students or looking in their community. I always try and help people see that they can lead from the seat that they're in. Leadership doesn't have to mean that you are moving up or the goal is to be at the very top of some hierarchy. It really is about what are you contributing in the seat you're in. And so whenever I can help people see what they bring to the table, that is always something that brings me a lot of joy. It's something that even back when I was a teacher's aide, I really enjoyed seeing students begin to develop as leaders and fellow classmates develop as leaders. So that's always something that I've been trying to help nurture.
I love that. And I know that there's probably, a lesson or maybe multiple moments that kind of changed the way that you've thought about leadership. Could you share a little bit maybe about a story or like something impactful that's kind of changed that perspective for you? And I always love to kind of tie it into like a personal moment that like had that spark as well. So yeah.
Absolutely. So I never thought, I think leadership changed for me when I was at my mom's house. My mom was not an educator, but she was a banker, and in her philanthropy work, she at one point was the chair of the Southern California Arthritis Foundation. And while I never thought of her as a leader, she was very successful in what she did. I never saw her as a leader because she was my mom. I saw her leading our family, but I didn't see her in that traditional sense. And so one of the times that I went to an event with her and I saw how she connected with people and how she connected other people to one another. And I think that really shifted my perspective on leadership, that it's not just about the responsibility, it's not just about the bottom line, but it's how do you bring people together for a common goal, a common purpose, and how do you empower them to then feel like they can make decisions that are going to contribute to that goal and really make a change in the work that they're doing. And so I think that was a key change for me. It didn't come from the education world, but just changing my perspective on how my mom was a leader, and I never saw it. I mean, I think I was like 35 years old when I realized the type of leader my mom was, and that really had an impact on me going forward.
That's amazing. And I'm also thinking a little bit about like, you mentioned your change even throughout the career in terms of being a leader. And I'm
Mhm.
curious to see what advice would you give to leaders who want to create, maybe that sustainability or even succession within their organizations as they're growing within their teams, as they're helping their teammates grow. What does that look like for you? And, could you talk a little bit about that too?
Sure. So when it comes to sustainability and growing leaders is really looking at what are the skills that your team has, but also what is the goal of the organization? What is the focus? What is the needs? Like really knowing your community, really knowing your goal, and then doing that match of where do you see leaders, current leaders, former leaders that maybe have taken a step back and you want to get them back involved, looking at what are their skill sets and how do you match those two things up. And then when there isn't a match or there's a gap, is really being mindful of, okay, what does this skill look like? And who do we think could, with some coaching or with some additional training, could fill those gaps and step into that role of leadership? I think as an assistant principal, especially, I got to work with teachers, and in the work with teachers that I would do with department chairs when we were working on like our accreditation and such, I had the opportunity to really, I found people who were really good writers. And if you're a good writer, that's going to translate into other things that you can do as a leader. And so then it was a matter of, have you ever considered? And oftentimes it's like, oh no, I'm not interested in that. And so then it's a conversation, and oftentimes that lack of interest had to do with confidence that a person had, or just not seeing themselves as leaders going forward. And so um, being able to have those conversations with people and help nudge them, I think that is key. If you're not identifying the next generation in leadership and you're in leadership, then you're not doing your job.
I love that. And I think that kind of ties a little bit into even probably the way you think about, building spaces for your students and right now. So that's really powerful too. And I want to kind of shift that over to courageous leadership. And I know that's something that like it's we talked about it a little bit before, but I want to talk a little bit more about what does courageous leadership look like when it means challenging systems that have been there for decades, right? Like I know
Mhm.
that maybe there have been some experiences from your past that like, have highlighted that, but I'd love to learn a little bit more about that too.
Sure. Courageous leadership is about having the courage to stand up for what you believe in and what you believe is right for students, for communities, for the organization that you serve, and not being afraid to ask questions. And change is always difficult. When people challenge the beliefs or the practices, that's always going to be, no, there we go. Sorry, I froze there for a second.
We can edit everything.
Okay, so change and challenging established practices or asking questions even can be really, it can be a problem for people to hear that. And you have to lean into that discomfort and be okay with reflecting. And so I think one of the pieces that I try and do as a leader is when we're looking at, for example, data of a certain student group, and we look at why are we placing students in classes under a certain model when that model clearly isn't working, even though it's what we've always done. It's time to really look at that. And I'll be the first to say change is hard. Even when something I believe that what I was doing was the right thing, and someone said, hey, I think you need to look at this a little bit, or have you ever wondered why? And it's hard, but I have to model as a leader, like I have to sit in that discomfort. I'm going to get a little, I'm going to take it personal. I have the four behind me. You kind of can see it. I have the four agreements from Don
Mm-hmm.
Miguel, and one of them is don't take it personal. And I remember it. I've got it on my computer as well. But in the moment of dealing with change and challenge, you have to remember that it's not personal. It's about the ultimate goal of student success. And so whether we're talking about breaking down barriers, improving practices, just shifting as we see with technology and how technology is constantly shifting the way we do instruction if we're doing it right. And so just leaning into that change and that discomfort. But also when you are the person that's pushing, you have to expect that pushback. And someone told me once that people need to hear something 7 to 99 times. And I think, which, I haven't gotten to the 99, but I always keep that in mind, especially when we're talking about change, that if you just say it once or twice, or you just check in once or twice, people are not going to finish processing that. You have to be constantly communicating, leaning into those relationships, helping them lean into the discomfort, and then coming out with a solution that's going to help students on the.
I love that. And I know you talked a little bit about, ensuring that, for multilingual learners, and, students who, we really want to make feel more supported in their environment and sometimes even more empowered. And I know that you're part of so many different organizations, whether it's through AXA, whether it's through, your other commitments as well. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're empowering your students to take on leadership roles, to take on areas beyond just their kind of day-to-day academics too?
Definitely, definitely. Well, student voice is key. When I was in Oro Grande School District, we started a group of students. It was called Shield, and it was about students helping in education leadership development. And it was really how do we help them shift the education and give voice to the practices that we had as we were going through and making decisions about things like the direction of whether it was the instructional model we were using, what we were doing with our bell schedule. This group of students, we brought them in, we built community, because that I think is a key piece, and talked to them about the purpose, and then empowered them through engaging with various speakers from the district and problem solving. We had a dress code that was very out of date, and we had them lead the dress code. And it was really interesting because there were some things that they were stricter than what was there. And then there were other things where they were very much more relaxed. And so as we were building into making sure that the dress code was culturally responsive and was current with the times and was as unbiased as possible, they were really the key leaders in that. And then also helped with rolling it out to teachers, because that was, and communicating it with other students. So, whenever you can give students voice and you can give them bring them together, and that doesn't just have to be in that formal way where it's governed by the principal or by the district office. In that case, that's something that can happen in your classroom as a teacher. As you are developing your students, how are you developing their leadership through hearing their voice, be through, when it comes time for certain selections, if you're in a language arts class and it's like, we're going to do a certain type of assignment, but you could do it reading this or reading this. Which one do you think is better? What would make more sense? And it's also, getting into UDL at a very low or at a very low entry point. But it's that idea of hearing from the students what makes sense to them. How are you making sure that they're connecting with the work in front of them? And then how do you grow that? How do you make sure that it's not just a one-time thing? Oh, you let them pick the novel they were going to read once, and now there's voice and choice in your classroom. How are you really helping them in their decision making? How are you giving them those tools? And how are you routinely helping them see how to apply that in their daily life? Students and families talk about how they want their students to have some very real practical life skills. And one of the key life skills that we can give and empower our students with as educators is their decision making. Being able to identify credible and reputable sources, being able to make a decision based on those things, and to be able to foresee or foreshadow consequences of the decisions or the recommendations they're making. And that is all part of the empowerment. It's not so much what you're empowering them to do, it's how are you empowering them in those skills.
That's awesome. And the other question I also had too, right? Because you talked a lot about these different strategies and these different areas that have really helped your students. And I'm curious also, how can schools start to embed wellness, not just part of a program, but even as part of like the culture of leadership and like teaching and like overall? And like, has there been anything that you've seen or you've done that has really kind of set your site or school up for success? Like, I'm just always curious about that because it's such an important piece of like all our day-to-day lives. And I'm sure nowadays, like even as part of students, just the wellness and not just the academic piece of it too.
Yeah, wellness I think is really tricky because it needs to be real wellness, not phony self-care. I mean, I love a pedicure just like the next girl, but that is not wellness. Yes, it's an opportunity for me to relax and take some time for myself, but that is not going to build sustainable wellness in what I'm doing overall. The other piece that I see in wellness is having the conversations about what does wellness mean to the community? What does it mean to the group that you're working with teachers, with students, with families? What does wellness mean? In some cases, wellness is access to healthcare and access to quality food and access to learning more about how food and your health go hand in hand and how does that play into fitness. In other cases, wellness is about recognizing that there is no such thing as balance. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. For a long time, I thought, if I could just find balance, everything would be great. Everything would be great. But I found with time, it doesn't exist. And in fact, I think it actually does more damage when we talk to people about trying to find balance, because when they can't find it or can't achieve it, it creates guilt, it creates shame, it creates this condition to where you're not feeling good enough, which then in turn has impact on your confidence as a leader, your confidence as a student, how you get involved in your community, how you show up. And so I really look at wellness as something that you have to look at as like a rhythm. There are going to be really hectic, chaotic, busy seasons, just like there are songs that have a really fast pace and you dance really fast when that's playing and you keep up and you do what you can, but then you're going to go into some other parts where it's really going to slow down. And that is time you need to slow down during that time. You need to be able to have some rest in there. You need to be able to reflect on that busy time that you had and what went well. And that I think also contributes to your wellness. I try and get 7.5 hours of sleep every night. It's somewhere between 6.5 and 7.5, depending on what's going on in my brain. But sleep, I think, is key to wellness. And I didn't realize that as a younger person. I fully functioned on, as long as I get 5.5 hours of sleep a night, I'm good. I could even function with 5 hours. And looking back, I wasn't functioning in a safe or I shouldn't say safe. I wasn't functioning in an environment that was conducive to my leadership, and it was missing that. I think the other piece is being intentional in times of rest and times of gratitude. One of the strategies during the pandemic, as we were trying to still build connection, and also as the shutdown carried on, got really hard for people. Taking those moments to reflect and to notice what was going on around them, those gratitude practices, we did a whole professional development on it. We identified some short articles, we identified some QR codes. It was something that was meant to be done from afar, but that you could bring back and do together. And that act of gratitude, that act of being intentional with your time, that rewires your brain. It rewires how you respond to stress. It rewires how you approach situations, and it really makes you a stronger leader. And that is something that whether you're a leader of your family, leader of your classroom, or leader of your school, that we all can benefit from.
I love that. And I also think it's great the way you just broke up leadership because it can happen in so many different areas, not just like
Mm-hmm.
we always think it's only work, it's only work. But no, it happens across so many different areas, like you shared with your story with your mom too. And I'm curious also, like, how you kind of transitioning to the next piece of empowering the next generation of leaders, which is something that you've done a great job doing. I'm curious to see how do you begin cultivating leadership in students sometimes even before they recognize it in themselves, because like a lot of times I feel like for students who are younger and they're still kind of growing into themselves, they're
Mm-hmm.
like, no, I don't think I'm a leader, like I'm not there yet. So how do you empower them to see that? And like, have there been any stories or moments that you want to share with our audience too that have really kind of touched your heart in so many different ways?
Sure. I think one of the key ways that we can start cultivating leadership at a young age is even through language and using, referring to students at a young age as leaders. They start to hear that, like, I'm not just a student, I'm a leader, or I'm the class president. I love when elementary schools have some form of representative government, student council that they're building. And so students are starting to see themselves from a very young age in those roles. But I think language is a key piece. I think also being really mindful of who is speaking up and what is the language we use for the student. I am guilty of, I was always in trouble in classrooms for talking too much. I was always in trouble in classrooms because I asked questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I had my own personal confidence and my support structure that said those are leadership qualities. And I think we need to look, especially with girls. I think it's true of girls and boys, but I think especially with young girls, when young girls are asking questions, when young girls are standing up for things that some people may think is tattletaling, but really they're standing up for justice. We need to recognize that, give them the appropriate tools and language. And so a project that I'm working on currently. In fact, tomorrow is our first meeting. We in Fontana did not have a seal of civic engagement. So our board took action to approve our criteria this past summer. And so we are building out the path to a civic leadership and engagement pathway and to that seal of civic engagement. And we're including students in that process.
I
And
love
it's
that.
high school, because it's high school driven, we're working with high school students. But as we include our administrators, our teachers, our community partners, we're also including our students because one, it needs to make sense to them, but two, they also need to, they know what is of interest and what makes sense in terms of what does it mean to be civically engaged. It's not just volunteering for beach cleanup and picking up trash. It's how are you organizing and advocating and building a community that is then going to be more ecologically focused? That's taking you more down the range of civic engagement. That is going to be something that's going to sustain you as a civic leader in whether it be in community organizations, in your future career, if you go into the public sector and in that field. Those are the skills and those are the ways that leadership can really start to grow. And those are things that will be on their resume as they're building out their resume. What better way to say I organized a voter drive at my school and we went out and we also helped walk the precinct, and we organized a way for them to get from their homes to their voting booths or to the post office to mail their ballot, whatever that process may be. What better way for a young scholar to be able to show as they're applying for jobs right out of high school or in high school, as they're applying for scholarships or organizations in college? What better way than to have that in their back pocket that, yes, I have these skills and I see how we are all connected.
That's awesome. And I know that you've done a lot of work with ALA Girls State, and you've seen young women grow into confident leaders. Can you talk a little bit more about what that whole experience is like for you and how you got into it? And yeah, I'd love to learn a little bit more about that too.
Sure. So I have been involved with California Girls State since 2010, and I did not get to participate in it as a high school student. You have to be a junior coming back for your senior year. I skipped my junior year, so I was not eligible to attend. But I was always familiar with the program. I had friends who had participated. The program's been around since 1940, so there is a long time, yeah, a long history of involvement. In fact, we're getting ready to, this June will be our third session since it was founded. And so I was at a time in my life where I was going through a divorce, and I called up one of my friends not to talk about Girl State and not to talk about the divorce, but just to talk about life, because we need our friends and we connection. And I was talking to my friend, and she happened to be a volunteer with the organization, and her response was, "Oh, great, you're not going to have anything to do this summer, you should come and volunteer at Girl State." And my initial thought was, well, that wasn't what I was looking for, but you know what, you're right. I don't have anything scheduled right now. Let's do this. I'll go. It'll be great. I'll experience it. And she had been trying to get me involved for a number of years, and it never worked in my calendar. I was like, I can do it once and then I'll never do it again, but I'll have satisfied that knowledge, and I did it and I loved it. California Girls State is building the 51st state of the United States. And the goal is we bring approximately 500 of some of the top rising senior students into together for a week. They don't know each other. It's Northern California students room with, I'm sorry, Northern room with Southern California, and they build a government. They start as a city, and then they build a city government and a county government. And then we get into the idea of parties, not from they build their party. They build a party platform, what's important to them. And the parties change every year based on who's attending the week, who's there for the leadership conference. And then the goal is to get to a state level, and then we have our whole mock government, state, county, city, and students are learning how to be involved and what government looks like in all those different ways. And we have students who plan to go into STEM fields or plan to go into something that they're like, I'm not interested in politics, I'm not interested in government. And then they very quickly discover how all of the issues that are important to them link through public policy and the field that they may want to major in college. So maybe you want to be a doctor, but what is the impact of insurance, or what is the impact of how communities make laws and have green space and how that impacts? And so the students get to build that. And I think one of the most exciting things is to see them showing up. They don't know anyone. There's only one delegate per high school that gets to come, so they're not coming with any friends. They show up, they get put in a city with 40 other delegates, and they build this amazing community. And I think the piece, we stress empowerment. We stress that there's 500 delegates, probably 400 of them are the ASB president at their school, and the other 100 that aren't are the president of their FHA or some other kinds of organization. So they're all leaders. How do you lead together? And we really want to push, this may be the first time that you do something and you fail, like you're not successful, you don't win. And so how do you build that resiliency? But how do you also learn to support and empower those that you are working with? That it doesn't have to be competition. It doesn't have to be that, well, we ran against each other and you won and I lost, and so now I don't want to be involved, or I think you're a horrible person. No, how do we work together? How do we build community, and how do we help each other? And when people do make mistakes and people do fail, how do we make sure that they're failing forward and they're growing from it, and that they have that epiphany of like, well, that really stinks that it didn't work, but what's next? What am I going to? Because I think that's one of the things that I see with younger generations, is that idea of having that resiliency to say what's next when something is disappointing. How do I dust off my backside, get back up and do it, and either support others and grow, or even look at it as, maybe I'm going to run for a different office, or I'm going to get involved in a different way. And so that empowerment piece is something that we really we best part, it's amazing to see the community that these 500 delegates build, but the best part for me, especially as an educator, is building the staff. The staff changes every year. There's some staff members that have been on the staff since 1980 when they came to Girl State themselves, and then there's people that have only been on for a short time, or they're brand new, and we have volunteers that are 75 years old, and we have volunteers that are 17, and everything in between. So building this community of leaders to be there as a support, and they don't we do all the behind the scenes work. We really want the experience to be a learning by doing model for the delegates. And so we do everything behind the scenes, but we let them make the decisions. We make sure that they use their powers and their intelligence for good and not evil, and we're there to supervise them, but they're running the experience. And it's so empowering to see how the women who make up our staff come together to support one another, how we support each other even outside of our staff time with interview support. We are each other's coaches, and we are each other's, circle of supporters. We read each other's resumes. When some are applying to grad school, we're, reading their applications. Someone's going for a job, we're helping with that. We connect people. We've had staff members that run for public office, and we have other staff members that have graphic design experience, and so they're the graphic designer for coming up with the logo for those pieces. So it's amazing to see the intergenerational sisterhood that develops from the 16-year-old attendees to our staff and our counseling group, and how that really is building an amazing format for building confidence, building leaders, and really building student voice.
I love that. And I think that really just goes to show the community also is part of that, which is really a lot of what you've talked about right now too, which is amazing. So the leadership and the community together, which is awesome. I guess the question I also want to, leave the audience with is, you've done so much across so many different areas of leadership, and I'm curious of what legacy do you hope to leave for that next wave of education leaders, right? And even just looking back to maybe when you were 18, 19, 20, right, starting off, what is one thing that you would, either tell yourself or tell, kind of future educational leaders who are coming up and growing up the ranks now, tips and words of wisdom just through that?
Yeah, it's not going to go the way you think it is. I thought I was going to be a teacher forever. I thought I would retire from teaching. I was really happy as a teacher working with young people. And due to a couple different things and conversations and opportunities, I've spent most of my career not being a teacher in the field. So I think it's important that people know that your best laid plans, they're not going to happen. But those best laid plans and the way that you think about and prepare yourself is going to help you be nimble and be able to navigate when those things don't go the way that you thought that they would, when life happens and you have to make some other choices, or things like when we've had the budget cuts. And I think of those educators from that era that were, wanted to be teachers, and they were teachers for a short time and then were laid off. And what did that look like? And so I think a legacy that I want to leave with the leaders that I'm helping to grow is do what you need to do to be flexible and to fail forward and to be willing to take a different path. And it's hard, and sometimes you need a minute. You got to stomp your feet, you got to cry, you got to be really upset and do a kickboxing class, but then you got to look at, okay, what are the skills I have? What is the need that exists? What is this new opportunity bringing me? and then you need to lean into it. And I have a sign on my wall. I'm going to read it because I always mess it up when I say it, but it says, "You can never get better without raising your level of anxiety." And I think that is such a true statement, because when things don't go the way you expect it to, it makes you take a moment to reflect, regroup, and reimagine what's next for you.
This is amazing. And I think you've left us with so many awesome takeaways today. I'm just even thinking about like things that I want to use personally in terms of my own leadership style. So this is awesome. I just want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today and for sharing so much amazing wisdom with all of us across so many different levels of leadership and education. So I appreciate your time today, and I want to thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure. I'm super passionate about the work that I can do, as you could hear and see. And so getting the opportunity to talk about it, it also gives me a moment to kind of pause and reflect on the difference that I'm making. Because again, we don't always see that as we're moving and working forward. And so thank you for this opportunity. It's been great.
Amazing. 1 second.